Good evening and welcome. My name is Cal Harris, and this is my story. Tonight is episode 4, Conviction and Prison, where I will walk you through the agony of having to endure 4 trials, 4 verdicts, 2 convictions, and life in prison over a 15-year period. If you have a question or comment, click on Say Something right below the yellow Cal Harris podcast. And all you have to do is just put in your email address if you haven't already. You're not signing up for a new account. You don't have to put any information in, and you won't get any junk mail from me. Let's get started. As I covered in episode 3, 4 years after Michele disappears, I'm indicted for her murder by a Tioga County grand jury in September of 2005. 2 years later, in the spring of 2007, I go on trial at the Tioga County Courthouse. After 6 years of almost daily news coverage, both locally and regionally, the emotions in Tioga County are at a fever pitch. They might as well have hung me from the village square, everyone standing around with pitchforks and torches. I had requested a venue change, but they are almost impossible to have granted in New York State. For those of you who have ever had the unfortunate experience of having your life in the hands of 12 strangers, you understand what a daunting experience that is, especially when they announce they have a verdict. Time comes to a complete halt. Your entire life flashing before your eyes. For me, that included my 4 young children. I was their only parent for the last 6 years. I spent every single day with them doing all the activities a normal parent would with kids that age. I even coached their youth teams at the local Boys and Girls Club. I was a very active parent. I had made provisions as to who would help take care of them under worst-case scenario, but couldn't fathom having to go down that path and tried to block it out. The jury walked into the courtroom and were seated in the jury box. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to throw up. They announced the verdict. Guilty. I don't remember much after that. It was all a blur. I could see what was happening around me, but it was in slow motion and there was no sound. I finally realized I'm in the back of a sheriff's patrol vehicle heading to the Tioga County Jail. When we get there, they process me in by changing me out of my civilian clothes and into the standard orange jumpsuit. They put me in a holding cell until they can process the rest of my info. Man, oh man, does time come to a complete standstill from here on out. I don't have a good recollection of time, but eventually they put me in a cell that's considered solitary confinement for 1 week. Apparently, it's standard procedure for all new inmates to break you down as much as possible before putting you in general population. Let me tell you, it works. 23 hours a day for 1 week, you're in this cell. You have 1 hour to take a shower and stand outside for a few minutes. No calls or visitation with your family. Completely cold turkey treatment. Imagine having no restrictions your entire life. Come and go as you please, even if it's just moving around the inside of your home. All gone. A total shock to your system. After 1 week, they moved me into general population, or what they call a pod. Here you're allowed to be out of your cell and interact with other inmates. eat meals, watch TV, play cards, take a shower, and call your family. Each day, the pod would go outside for rec, which was about 45 minutes, where you could walk, work out, or just hang out in the fresh air. Visitations were on the weekends and lasted about an hour. And as you can see in this photo, the inmates would come in from the back of the enclosure there, and you would find a seat inside that partition, and then your family would come in the front door right here, and they would find a seat around the outside. And you can see the half glass there. You were allowed to stand up and lean over that half glass and give your family a quick hug. They were real careful to make sure that family members weren't giving the inmates some illegal paraphernalia. So it was only for a brief moment. This was the hardest part for me every single time. I had to put up a good front for my kids to let them know that I was all right and that everything was going to be okay. Seeing the pain and sadness on their faces was excruciating. The worst was when visitation was over and they had to leave. I had to stay strong until they were out of sight and then go back to my cell where I would break down and cry for hours. People wonder why I'm a little bitter at times. Walk a mile in my shoes and you'll understand. About a month later, a glimmer of hope. Apparently, a witness came forward right after the verdict. They reached out to my attorney and said, "I think I now understand that I saw Michele and another man at the end of the Harris driveway in the early morning hours of September 12, 2001. This man was a local farmer who lived and farmed land near our home in Spencer, New York. His name is Kevin Tubbs." My attorney didn't want to notify me until he thoroughly checked out this guy's story. Turns out Kevin Tubbs' story is legit. So much so that 6 months later, the judge throws out my conviction and orders a new trial. I'll never forget that day sitting in the courtroom. The judge looked down and said, "Release him." I'm sitting there in my orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, shackled, and shaking. I just put my head down and cried. It felt like a ton of bricks had just been lifted off my chest, and I could finally breathe. Unfortunately, this would be just one of many highs and lows during this 15-year nightmare. I'll also never forget coming home to see the kids and my youngest son, Tanner, running up to me in the driveway, grabbing me around the neck and squeezing as hard as he possibly could. In the previous episodes, I showed you just how despicable Sue Mulvey and Gerald Keene were in coming after me. You can only imagine what they did to Kevin Tubbs and his family. Kevin Tubbs was public enemy number one. They went after him as if he committed the crime himself. Despite the judge's ruling that his testimony and that of his parents was entirely credible and something the jury needed to hear. Under normal circumstances, the state police and the district attorney would have reached out to Kevin Tubbs to find out more and seek the truth. But as you saw firsthand in this video from episode 3, the truth for Gerald Keene, quote, doesn't really fit. This is the video at Henry Lee's office in Connecticut. Henry Lee offers to do an amylase test on the throw rug that was lying on the floor just inside the kitchen entranceway from the garage. The throw rug is important because under their theory, Michele comes home the night of September 11th, 2001, and she gets home around 11:30 where I'm supposedly laying in wait. She comes into the kitchen entranceway where I attack her with a blunt instrument, striking her in the head and cracking her skull, and it's bleeding. They then theorize I hit her at least once more, maybe twice, and she's standing on the throw rug, and there's sub-millimeter stains on the throw rug. Some of them come back with her DNA. The amylase test for blood that is aspirated out of the mouth and nose, either through coughing or sneezing or spitting up. If the amylase test comes back positive and it's aspirated versus direct blood from a bludgeoning that they theorize, it blows Jerry Keene's case to pieces. And Jerry Keene does not want this test done, even though Henry Lee offers to do it right in front of Jerry Keene and Sue Mulvey of the state police. So this video shows Henry Lee's assistant coming in to do a demonstration of the amylase test. And I want you to watch Jerry Keene's face real close, because for a brief moment, Jerry Keene panics and he thinks that the assistant has done the test on the throw rug. And you'll watch his face. He's got this scowl on his face. He's panicking. And he says, "Did they do the test on that stain on the rug?" And they're like, "Oh, no, this is just a demonstration." And Jerry Keene says, "Well, it doesn't really fit." Meaning, it doesn't fit his narrative. And if it doesn't fit his narrative, he doesn't want it done, and he's not seeking the truth. And he's not seeking the truth with Kevin Tubbs' story either. I'm going to play the video. You see for yourself. Take a good close look at Jerry Keene's face and listen to what he has to say.
Do you want anything about the science of the test or anything?
Oh, whatever you wish or feel.
Okay.
Was that on this swab that they took from
No, obviously, no, I just think that.
That doesn't really fit.
Just an example.
Do you want anything about the science?
Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said? Did you see his face? He's panicking. He doesn't want the truth. He doesn't want that test done because it doesn't really fit. Now, Jerry Keene is a district attorney. He's got unlimited power. When he took the oath after he got elected, he took an oath to uphold the law and to seek the truth. Jerry Keene is doing anything but seeking the truth in this investigation, whether it's the throw rug or Kevin Tubbs. By the time my second trial starts 2 years later in 2009, Kevin Tubbs gets destroyed by Sue Mulvey, Gerald Keene, and the local media. Despite his testimony and that of his parents, the jury comes back with yet another guilty verdict. But once again, it all comes down to the photographs that were, quote, treated and altered by Sue Mulvey and Gerald Keene. And this is the next video that shows Jerry Keene and Sue Mulvey showing Henry Lee, their expert witness, the photographs that were taken in my home. And Jerry Keene says that these photographs were treated and altered. Sue Mulvey chimes in, trying to cover for him by saying that it was exposure correction. Henry Lee, realizing what a bonehead mistake this is, Jerry Keene admitting that they've tampered with these photographs, Henry Lee tries to cover for him, and he changes the terminology from treated and altered to enhanced. He's a very crafty expert witness. He's testified in hundreds of trials. So he knows he's on video live. And so he smoothly transitions into, well, it's just enhancement. You're just enhancing the photos, and that's acceptable. And you're not altering the stains. You're not moving the pattern of the stains around. So that's okay too. That's not what's happening. I'm going to play the video and we'll talk about it for a second. I want you to look closely at Sue Mulvey's face too. She's lying. She knows she tampered with these photographs.
Treated them and.
Exposure correction.
What did they do, sir?
Exposure
Correction.
They
Yeah,
corrected the
exposure,
Yeah.
and it actually lightened it up to the point where you could see things in the, that part of the photograph that you
Sure.
couldn't see before. Would those types of pictures be of any value to you, or once the picture has been altered, is it?
Well, you think defense going to definitely argue that, but on the other hand, image enhancement is a acceptable technique used. So you just say this is a image enhancement. You just the original image you just enhance. You are not alter the pattern. You just enhance the image. So that's the differences. If you start changing, say tracing, or changing the pattern, that become an issue. If you did not.
You see how smooth Henry Lee is? You see how he just smoothly transitioned to enhancement? Well, you didn't enhance him, and that's perfect. Enhance him, and that's perfectly acceptable. And you didn't change the pattern. That's not what's happening here. Sue Mulvey and Jerry Keene took these photographs and took them to a professional. And just like Jerry Keene admitted to, they were treated and altered. And what they did is they treated the submillimeter stains that are on these photographs to make them brighter, more vibrant than they really were. Or, as Henry Lee testified to at trial, they were vivid red, meaning, in his opinion, they were 2 to 3 days old and fresh. That's what gets me convicted, ultimately. Here's the other kicker, as I mentioned in episode 3. The originals are missing. This is a multi-million-dollar investigation and preparation for trial. No stone was overturned. Every minute detail was examined and documented and recorded. For 6 years, from 2001 to 2007, when the first trial started. 6 years they did this. And somehow, all of a sudden, the original photographs are missing? Steve Anderson took dozens of photographs inside my home, and they're all missing? There's not one or two or three? Not a chance. The original photographs are missing because they don't show a crime scene, period. At the time, my attorneys and I simply didn't know or understand what Sue Mulvey and Gerald Keene did to these photographs. Despite the fact that Gerald Keene had a legal obligation to notify us that the originals were missing. Ironically, years later, when I do my own investigation before my third trial, we find out that Kevin Tubbs was spot on. The description he gives about the man standing at the end of our driveway with Michele in the early morning hours of September 12, 2001, matches exactly
Do you want anything about the science of
with this man, Stacy Stewart, on the left-hand side, the left photo, in the dark hair and the beard. Kevin Tubbs describes Stacy Stewart to a T. And not only that, he describes Stacy Stewart's pickup truck to a T. No way Kevin Tubbs makes up those two facts. No way that that's a coincidence. When the guilty verdict is read, the vicious roller coaster ride that my kids and I were on drops to a new low. I can see what's going on, but everything is in slow motion and there's no sound. Once again, I'm in the back of the Sheriff's Patrol car heading over to the Tioga County Jail. Same routine as last time. Process, change clothes, holding cell, solitary confinement for a week, and then general population. Only this time, there's no glimmer of hope. I'm going to the big house, a maximum security prison. After a few months at the Tioga County Jail, I have my sentencing hearing back at the courthouse. As I told you in the previous episode, I had more to say about certain individuals, starting with this man right here, John Andrews. From the previous episode, you know that John Andrews is Sue Mulvey's father, and that years prior, John Andrews used to work for me as a salesman in one of the dealerships. And John Andrews wound up being a bad guy. He was a liar. He made promises to customers he couldn't keep. He caused trouble. He was just a bad guy. And I fired him. And that was a huge problem for John Andrews and his daughter, Sue. And they held a grudge for a long time. And so when Michele came up missing, Sue Mulvey put herself on as the lead investigator on my case. And from that point on, the investigation took the path that it did. And John Andrews was in the background pushing buttons as well. So here's what happens. The day of my sentencing, John Andrews comes to the courthouse, and he comes into the courtroom. But instead of sitting on the side behind the prosecution, where his daughter Sue was sitting, John Andrews comes over and sits behind me, on my side. And he sits right behind my father. Now, this is in a very emotional time for my father and I. And I'm turning around and I'm looking at him throughout the hearing. And, I'm getting sentenced to 25 years of life. I'm going away. I'm probably going away forever. I'm going to be in prison until the end of my life. And so I'm turning around throughout the hearing and I'm looking at my dad and we're catching some eye contact. Every time I turn around and look at my father, John Andrews pops his head around from behind my dad and he winks at me. He's winking at me as if to say, aha, we got even with you for firing me. He's winking at me every time I turned around. That's what kind of guy he is. It speaks volumes about him as a man and the way he raised his daughter, Sue. They're two peas in a pod. They are sick individuals. The next two people I want you to talk more about is this guy here, Mike Young. And in the previous episode, you find out that he is an investigator for Troop C. Not the sharpest tool in the shed, not the brightest guy at Troop C, and it showed with the assignments that he was given. And the one assignment he was given was to go to the school that my kids were attending, and they were 7, 6, and 4 at the time. And Mike Young would go to the school during school hours, and he would walk up and down the hallways, and then he would bust into the classrooms while they were in session, and he'd be supposedly asking questions like he was doing some kind of investigation. But what he really was doing was harassing and embarrassing my kids in front of their classmates and the teachers and the parents. The other person that was involved was his wife, Virginia. And his wife, Virginia, would run her mouth to the moms at the school, supposedly providing them with inside information that she was getting from her husband, Mike, about the investigation. Well, between the two of them, they accomplished what they wanted to. My kids were eventually blackballed. They weren't allowed to hang out with their friends. They weren't invited to birthday parties. These two totally destroyed my kids at a time when they needed the school more than anything to get away from what was happening in their lives. And so these two also come to my sentencing. And not only do they come, they bring their 14-year-old daughter, who's in 9th grade, in the same class as my daughter. And they take her out of school and they bring her to the courthouse to my sentencing. And after the sentencing was over and I was being taken out of the courthouse, the three of them make sure that they position themselves within a few feet of me as I'm walking through the courthouse. And Mike Young's got that smirk on his face like you see now. And Virginia's got a smirk on her face as well. And their 14-year-old daughter is standing there a few feet away from me. And the reason they brought her is so that they could take her back to school and she could tell all the classmates that was in my daughter's class, 9th grade, about what she saw that day, and that Cal Harris got sentenced and he's going to prison for life and he was shackled and handcuffed. And that's the sick behavior that happened with these individuals at Troop C. It was strictly to harass and embarrass my kids every step of the way. Now, eventually, the moms at the school realize who Virginia and Mike really are. And they realize that Virginia is just trash. No class whatsoever. She's a gossiper. She's a backstabber. She's a troublemaker. And they realize who she is after time. They also find out that Mike is a very jealous husband. And he's very, very controlling of his wife, Virginia. After my sentencing, I'm transferred to the Elmira Correctional Facility in Elmira, New York. This facility was built in 1876, and it showed. This is what my cell looked like, and this was my baptism as a convicted felon. I wouldn't have allowed my dog to be put in there. The Elmira prison was also the main hub for transferring inmates around the state to other prisons. This part of Elmira I called the Gauntlet. The inmates in this cell block are being moved shortly to another location. As you can see, it's 4 floors and about 100 yards long. From 7 a.m. till 10 p.m., it is an absolute madhouse. Me and the inmates in my cell block would have to walk through here multiple times a day to the mess hall, gym, showers, and visitation. All the way through, we were under attack. They would yell and scream obscenities, throw wads of wet toilet paper, bars of soap. They'd spit on us, and worse. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. I will never forget walking through this place. It was an absolute zoo. After a few months here, I then get transferred to the Auburn Correctional Facility in Auburn, New York. Built in 1818, it's one of the oldest prisons in New York State and one of the oldest in the country. And it also showed. This is what my cell looked like. These photos aren't treated or altered. This is the real deal. Now, this is 2 separate cells. It's not one big cell. And the individual cells, and this is exactly the cell, one exactly looked like the cell that I was in. They're about 6 feet wide and about 9 feet long. Again, if the dog warden came to your house and witnessed your dog living in those conditions, you'd be arrested for animal cruelty. Speaking of dogs, this is my boy Charlie. He is my therapy dog. He is my co-pilot. He's my best friend. And he and I spend every day together. And he's part of the reason that I use the dog reference. Charlie's a good man. And I just had to show you a picture of him. This is an overhead shot at the Auburn prison. At the bottom of the photograph is the front entrance where families and civilians would come in for visitation. Just behind the main entrance in the center of the prison there, that's called the main yard. And in that main yard, it's surrounded by the cell blocks. You see a square building there at the bottom. And that building was built in the 1970s. That's not part of the 1818 original construction. And that building is two stories high. And the ground floor is the chaplain services with a church and a couple offices. It also houses the regular library and the law library. On the second floor is a regular gym, like a regular high school gym that you'd see at a high school, with lockers and showers. Now, showers are a big thing in prison because you never know when you're going to get your next showers. There's no showers in the cell blocks. They had a few small buildings that were all glass in the main yard, and to the left, you see another open space that was called the small yard. And they had 2 glass buildings in each of the yards where you could go and take a shower. But you had to stand out there, all year round. And rec time was only for a little bit, maybe an hour or so. And you'd have to stand in line and wait to get in. And that's where when I first got there, I got there in January. And I spent many a night standing out there freezing, trying to get my shower, only to have to wait in line and rec be shut down. And then I'd have to go back to my cell. So I worked in this building, in the chaplain's office, and I worked in the regular library. I made 37 cents an hour. Quite the irony for me. But I clearly didn't do it for the money. I did it to get out of my cell as much as possible. So one of the perks in working in that building is that you could take a break from your work and you could run upstairs and take a shower, and you'd be guaranteed your shower for the day. So that was huge for me. But between working those 2 jobs, rec time in the yard, researching my case in the law library, and visitation, I still averaged 17 hours a day in my cell. And I tried to be as busy as possible. And I still averaged 17 hours a day. This is what each floor looked like. And this is the walkway down each floor. And as you can see, the cells are on the right and the steel bars are on the left. And it's an enclosed, tight space. I lived in fear every minute of every day while I was in prison. I was always on the lookout, over my shoulder. I always stood against the wall so no one was behind me. And this was a scary place for me because each day, 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the COs would crack us out of our cells, and we'd have to stand in single file, close our cell doors, and wait for the CO to take us to and from the mess hall. So the concern for me was, as we're all standing in a line there, facing forward, and if someone decided to go off and attack, me or the next person behind me or whoever, there's no place to run. There's no place to hide. I mean, you're trapped in there and probably have a hard time defending yourself. Okay, so this is what the cell blocks look like. Now, this isn't Auburn. This facility is much newer and much nicer. I couldn't find a picture of Auburn, so this must be a newer prison somewhere in New York. But this is the same layout. And what's interesting is the way the inmates would communicate in this layout. And what they would do is each inmate had a net bag. And the net bag was a mesh bag about the size of a backpack. And you use this bag to carry clothes, shower items, commissary, books, legal paperwork, etc. And the reason it was mesh is so that the COs could see what you were carrying and making sure that you didn't have something illegal like a shank in your bag. And what they would do is they would tie shoestrings to the mesh bag and they would weight it down with a combination lock. And then they would throw the net bag out of their cell and through those metal bars and down to somebody below them in the floor below or 2 floors below them. And what they were doing is they were exchanging notes and drugs and cigarettes and coffee and any other miscellaneous stuff. So whoever the inmate was below would reach out with a broom, and he'd snag the bag and bring it into his cell, and then read a note or put in with the bag whatever the guy above him wanted. And if it wasn't, the inmate wasn't right below, another inmate would grab the bag and then just pass it down a few cells. But the communication and what these guys did, with what little resources they had, was unbelievable. And that's just one example. Now, each floor had a porter, and a porter was an inmate who lived on that floor and whose job it was to keep the walkway clean. And he would sweep and mop and take out the garbage from each inmate, and he would bring hot water. They would bring hot water in a 30-gallon container that was on wheels, and he would wheel that container up and down the walkway, and it had a hose sticking out from it. And he'd pull up to your cell, and he'd stick the hose through your bars. And if you had a plastic pail, a 5-gallon pail, which I was lucky enough to get my hands on one, he'd fill your 5-gallon pail with hot water. This was especially helpful during lockdowns, which would happen frequently. If there was a stabbing in the yard, the entire facility would shut down and everyone would be locked in their cells for 1 week, 24 hours a day for 1 week, while the COs searched and tossed every single cell in the facility looking for the shank. Some 1,800 inmates. With the hot water in my 5-gallon bucket, I could take a bird bath every day and then do my laundry and hang up my clothes to dry with shoestrings from my shoes. For meals, they would bring us a paper bag lunch with 2 slices of bread, a slice of bologna and cheese, a juice bottle, and a cookie. This was for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the same thing, all day, every day. If it was raining, the whole bag and meal would be soaked, so you'd have to eat a soggy sandwich and a soggy cookie. Since you're not allowed to have cash on your person or in your cell, the currency in prison is postage stamps. Your family would put money into your commissary account, and then you would go to commissary to buy stamps, food, tobacco, coffee, toiletries, and miscellaneous items that were allowed inside your cell. Almost everybody had a hustle or a way to make money in prison. Inmates that could afford to buy a big pouch of tobacco or coffee would come back to their cells and make rollies. Only they wouldn't use regular rolling paper, they would use toilet paper. 3 rollies cost 1 stamp. If it was coffee, they would make what's called a shot, or just enough coffee to make 1 cup. And they would wrap that in toilet paper too, in a pouch. That also cost 1 stamp. Now, that was 10, 12 years ago, so I don't know what inflation's been like in prison, but that's how much it cost back then. You were allowed to cook in your cell and buy a hot pot from commissary. The big item was banquet chicken and rice. You would go to the commissary and buy a box. It was frozen. You'd bring it back to your cell, heat it up in the hot pot, take the chicken out, and then put in rice and make rice. And then they would mix it with peas and carrots, out of a can, and they'd make a meal out of it. And that was the main meal because it was the easiest. But these guys made other meals too that were unbelievable. I mean, they even made desserts. They would make cheesecake that supposedly was delicious. I had an inmate make me dinner one night with a banquet chicken, rice, peas, and carrots. Now, you need to understand, respect in prison is huge. It's one of the few things that you have left. You need to be careful not to disrespect someone or risk retaliation. Naturally, I was reluctant to eat this meal since they're making these meals in their cells over the toilets. There was no way I could disrespect this guy. It was an honor that he made dinner for me. So I had to eat it, and it was good. Afterwards, I got thinking, well, it can't be any worse than the mess hall. I couldn't imagine what was going on in the kitchen behind closed doors. And I hadn't died yet, and I hadn't gotten sick. Since I didn't do drugs, smoke, or drink coffee, my craving was chocolate. When your family came to visit, they could bring a certain amount of restricted groceries, and those groceries had to be packaged, and then the contents inside the package wrapped also. My family would bring me Hershey chocolates and Dove chocolates because they were individually wrapped. In addition to savoring these delicacies in my cell 17 hours a day, I would hand these out as tips to other inmates. For example, when I would do my research in the law library, inmates who worked there would have to pull out these huge law books off the back shelf that weighed about 5 pounds each. You were allowed to take out 3 books at a time. So these guys were working hard for you. And some nights I'd be there and I'd go through 6 or 9 or 12 law books in a night. So by the end of the night, I had to make sure I took care of these guys. And I would give them a handful of these Dove chocolates. And you'd have thought I handed them a $100 bill. Their faces would light up. They'd be so happy because they didn't get anything like this. You know, whatever money they had, they would buy cigarettes and coffee and whatnot. So they knew that I appreciated what they did for me. And it was pretty nice. Now, while all of this is going on, my appeal is being heard at the 3rd Department, Appellate Division in Albany, New York. I felt good about the appeal, even though I was trying not to get my hopes up. Eventually, more bad news and another new low on the roller coaster ride of emotions. My appeal was denied. But another glimmer of hope. One of the judges that heard my appeal dissented from the majority. This man, Judge Bernard Malone, Judge Malone literally saved my life. By law, if a judge dissents in an appeal at this level, the judge can take the case up to the highest court in New York, the Court of Appeals. If he does take it up to the Court of Appeals, they have to hear the case. Otherwise, you as an individual must file an application to have your case heard. The Court of Appeals hears less than 1% of all those applications. In addition to taking my case up to the Court of Appeals, Judge Malone wrote a blistering 23-page dissent, unheard of in an appeal like this. Now, the hours and hours that I spent in the law library, I looked at hundreds and hundreds of cases, appeals on cases like mine, or as close to mine as I could get. And there were dissents on a lot of these appeals. And whoever the judge was that dissented from the majority, they would write like a 4 or 5 page dissent explaining why the majority got it wrong, and he would give his opinion. But the most, and I looked at hundreds and hundreds of cases, and the most I ever saw was a dissent that was 4 or 5 pages long. That was it. Judge Malone writes a 23 5-page dissent. He did his job, while the other judges were lazy and just rubber-stamped Jerry Keene's conviction. Judge Malone dove deep into my case and exposed all the flaws in Gerald Keene's prosecution, as well as his colleagues neglecting their duties. In my opinion, this played a huge role in front of the 7 judges at the Court of Appeals, where they unanimously overturned my conviction and ordered a new trial. A new high in the roller coaster of emotions. And at this point, I don't know how much more I can take. I get released from the Auburn Correctional Facility at the end of October 2012 after spending a total of 4 years incarcerated and ripped away from my kids 3 different times. Being reunited with my kids was a blessing, but the dark cloud of a third trial was still hanging over our heads. I'm finally granted a venue change to Schoharie County, just south of Albany, New York, about 2 hours from Tioga County. I'm sorry, just south of Albany, New York, and about 2 hours from Tioga County. Shortly after my second conviction in 2009, Gerald Keene gets his wish and is elected judge in Tioga County, a position that he still holds to this day. The new DA is this man, Kirk Martin. No exaggeration, this guy is a drunken sexual predator who was fired from the DA's office years earlier for crashing his car drunk 3 different times and putting everyone's life in the village at risk. He's also caught sexually assaulting young women by pressuring them to trade sexual favors for throwing out their tickets and fines. Again, you can't make this stuff up. These guys are unbelievable. In early 2015, we go to trial, and Kirk Martin uses the same playbook as Gerald Keene in the first 2 trials. And why not? If it's not broke, don't fix it. Once again, the jury comes into the courtroom with a verdict. Same emotions for me as the first 2 trials. Only this time, my 4 children are sitting behind me in the courtroom. And of course, there's more drama. The jury is hung and can't come to a unanimous decision. I'm now really starting to lose my mind. Is this really happening? It seems like every step of the way, this thing gets dragged out further and further, and there's just one turn, twist and turn after another. For the next several days, the judge keeps pushing the jury to go back and come up with a verdict. But to no avail, they're hung. The jury is split almost down the middle. 7 not guilty, 5 guilty. And the judge orders a mistrial. Not great, but certainly better than the alternative. Naturally, Kirk Martin motions for a 4th trial in Schoharie County. About a year later, in the spring of 2016, we're back again, and at this point, I'm about as spent can be for someone in this position. I'm simply exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and I'm at the end of my rope. I really don't know how much more I can take. Finally, on May 24th, 2016, 1 day before my birthday, I get the best present one could possibly ask for. An acquittal and my freedom. It was very emotional. All 4 of my kids were sitting behind me. I had my head down on the table and my eyes closed. I didn't want to hear the verdict. And I didn't hear the verdict at first. One of my attorneys sitting next to me put their arm around me and whispered in my ear, "Congratulations." And that's when I knew. I turned and looked at my kids and couldn't believe how emotional they were. They were all crying and sobbing really hard. Clearly, they were holding a lot inside for the last 15 years. Needless to say, my time in prison was an experience few people will truly understand. I learned a lot, and I intend to use that knowledge to make change going forward. My future podcast will address social issues like criminal justice reform and exposing the mass corruption that permeates every aspect of our criminal justice system, from law enforcement to prosecutors and judges. I want to thank all of you that are watching tonight, and those that are watching that also came to visit me at Auburn. And I know that was a hard thing, the security getting in, strip search, and some of you traveled a long way. But I want to just thank you again for coming and giving me a few hours to escape and be able to talk to somebody from the outside. And I will be forever grateful to all of you that came and did that for me. So tonight, this is the end of the podcast. Next week, episode 5, I think we'll take a trip down memory lane. I have some home videos of Michele and the kids, Michele interacting with the kids. I think I'm going to show a few of those. They've never been seen before. You'll get to see Michele and hear her voice and her interacting with the kids. And then after that, we start pushing hard for social justice. So that's it for tonight. If any of you have any questions, I'll stick around for a minute and answer any of those. I'm going to put my closing page on here to let you know that there's other ways to reach out to me and ask questions on my Facebook, my Twitter account. And there's some really good information on my website, TiogaCountyWoodchucks.com. I'm just going to put that up for a minute and then I'll come back. All right. I'll hang out for a few minutes more, and anybody have any questions or comments? I had some technical difficulty early, around 7 o'clock when I was supposed to start. I thought I was on and I wasn't, so I'm redoing this again tonight. And for those of you that missed it, I apologize. I'll make some posts on Facebook and Twitter letting you know that I had to redo the podcast. And again, I'm learning as I go, and I'll get better at this going forward. So hang out just for another minute or so and see if there's any questions. Well, I probably screwed everybody up from earlier, so we'll end it for tonight. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week, hopefully without any hiccups.